Kære himmelske far, jeg takker dig for den her nye dag, du har givet os. Tak fordi vi har fået lov til at stå ud af vores senge. Jeg beder om, at du vil hjælpe os til at bruge dagen godt. Jeg beder om, at du vil være nær i det møde, vi skal være sammen om nu. Jeg beder om, at du vil være med Jay. Jeg beder om, at du vil give ham alt, hvad han har brug for. Velsign ham og velsign os og det, vi skal være sammen om. I dit navn, Jesus. Amen.
Godmorgen. I think this is the first morning since I've arrived to Denmark that I don't feel jet lagged. That I woke up and I felt awake. It was great. Because when I wake up at 8, it's 2 o'clock in the morning for me, you know, and my body's going, what are you doing? And then it looks out and says, why is there sun out? This is crazy. And that's a good feeling to wake up and feel rested. You know, to feel like you're done for the night, rather than maybe another hour or two, but to feel like I'm ready. Yeah, yeah. When we sing this about, you know, when we come into the new morning, and we sing about the morning, and God makes every morning new again. You know, sometimes the last couple of days I was like, this is not a new morning. This is a very old morning. But today, it's new, yeah? It's new. I want you to be refreshed today, and to hear new, the good news. To hear fresh what God is doing today. That after spending so much time thinking of how we have fallen short and how we are hanging on and stuff, that today we get to hear that God is good. That God is here for us, and that we can trust God. And that God is going to do new things with us today. So the story of God. I do this every morning. You know that I do, because we say repetition is the key to learning. Does that translate? Yeah? So we repeat so we can remember. Chapter 1 is... And God made everything and said it was good. Yeah. I like that you still do it. Right? You didn't give up on that. You're good. Yeah. Is that Louis Armstrong? You know? Good. God said it was good. And God created so that you would create. To be a part of God in creation. And that you were made in the impression of God. What is it? What is that in what is it? Bill? Image, picture. But what if you were to take, say if you were to take something and you're to press it into clay? Okay, so something like that. So pressed into us is God, yeah? Pressed into us. It's God. And that this is a part of who we are, that we, of all of God's creation, in a very special way, feel, understand, know the will of God. So, creation. And then we have the fall. We have the fall. And if you're really, really good, the fall doesn't affect you, right? Huh? No, I thought it was only for the really bad people. Right? No. For it says, all fall. All fall. All fall short. We all fall. No one gets out of it. It's a ticket we all punch. We're all on that train. Done. We all fall short. And in that, all we have left is to give up. It's just to give up and to fall. And we began to hear last night then about Jesus. We began to hear at our worship about redemption. What does it mean to be redeemed? And how does this redemption come? And if we are to trust God, how do we know we can trust God? What evidence is there that we can trust God? I mean, what do we see? What do we know? How do we know that God is going to do good for us? And I want us to, when we focus on this, I'm going to give you the phrase now, and we're going to look into this. The way that God's story makes itself apparent in redemption, the way every chapter of the Bible and then through this works, is that God does this. And I'll ask you to repeat after me. It goes, God takes a mess and makes a miracle. Can you say that? God takes a mess and makes a miracle. One more time. God takes a mess and makes a miracle. In the same way that I love this image that we've made, this chaos behind, just this, all of these pieces of wood that are all sort of banged together and beautiful in a way, but at the same time sort of unsettling, somehow not orderly. But then out of the chaos, God makes a cross. So from the chaos, from the same wood, God makes a cross. Yeah? So God takes a mess and makes a miracle. Boy, there is so much in here that it's okay if I take 3 hours? Is that okay? Okay, 3 hours. There's so much that even as I was praying this morning and pondering which pieces of the story to share, I kept thinking and coming back to the story that the books, the Jacob and the prodigal. But you had first, what was the word you had for prodigal son? It was a different word. It started with an F. Was that? Yeah, that's it. So if we could turn to that. This is in Lucas. Chapter 15, verse 11. Now remember, Jesus is a master storyteller. That he always uses stories to help us understand God. Rather than just teaching like a class, he wants us to be invited into the teaching. And he wants us to feel where we are in the story. And because we learn with our head, but we learn best with our head and our heart. Yeah? So when it's our head and our heart, that's when we learn best. And so Jesus tells this story. So, there were 2 sons. Let's say Jesper, and I'm going to pick one I can't say very well. Varighed. Did I say that okay? Okay, I'm not very good at that one. Jesper, Varighed. So, 2 sons, and Jesper, the younger son. And in the Hebrew culture, the older son receives everything. All of it. The younger son receives not much. Nothing. But the younger son says to the father, "Hey, Dad, I want half of everything you have." Now, when does the older son inherit? When the dad dies. So, essentially, the younger son says, "Father, I wish you were dead, and I want half your stuff now." Right? Now, if you were the father, what would you say? Psh, go to your room, right? Wouldn't you? Your son just asked you to be dead. I wish you were dead. Something's going on. Hello? Is this for air? Hi. What is your name? Oh, I wish it was Jesper. Wouldn't that be great? Yeah, right. Jesper. No? He's doing a good job, right? Yeah. All right, excellent, okay. So, Jesper says, "Dad, I wish you were dead, and I want half your money." But the dad, for reasons you can barely understand, says, "Okay, son, you can have half of it. You can have half. Go ahead." So, it says, in verse 13, a few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country. And it says there he squandered his property in dissolute living and bad living. And then it said, when he had spent everything, a severe famine came on the land. And he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. Now, in the Hebrew culture, how do they see pigs? They are considered unclean animals. They don't disregard their own filth. They're dangerous with disease. And to touch a pig and to be in the pig's filth would make you unclean. And no one would be allowed to touch you because they would become unclean by touching you. You follow? So he goes from having everything, spending it all, and then a famine comes, and so nobody can eat, and so he goes to do the lowest of the low work, the bottom of the barrel. I don't know what that job is like for you. For me, it was washing dishes at a restaurant. It's not that big a deal, not that hard. I don't want to oversell it, but it stunk. It smelled horrible. And I sat with the dishes, and they would come over to this long table tray, and they would throw the plate across, and food would go. And then I'd wash and stick. And it was hot. We had this huge washing machine that you'd stick it in, and it was so hot, you would run it through because the hot would disinfect the dishes. And then you'd have to, like, grab the dishes to take them, and you'd be like, ha, 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 ha. And I have a scar here on my hand that I'll have for the rest of my life from a knife, from washing, sticking my hand in, and blood. And it smelled, and it was terrible. It was the worst job for me. It was awful. And it's interesting for me that I had that job at the very time in my life when I was like, where are you, God? Who are you, God? Because I hated going to work. Hated it. And I can imagine that young man in the pigs, in the fields, not thinking like, oh, good, I've got a job. But every day, going to his job and saying, this is awful. What am I doing here? What am I doing here of all places? It says he would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. Now the pods, what do you normally feed your pigs? Garbage? Trash? Yeah? We, at the camp that I worked at, we scraped all our food into a bucket, and then the pig farmers came, and they picked up the buckets, and they fed the pigs. He would have loved to have eaten other people's food off their plates. He would have loved to have eaten the refuse, the trash, the stuff nobody else wants to eat. He wanted to eat. This is his desperation. But then it says, he came to himself. It means, aha! And he says, now, how many of my father's workers have plenty to eat and they have extra? But here I am, and I'm so hungry, I don't know what to do with myself. So I will get up to my father and I will say, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm not fit to be called your son. Hire me as one of your workers. So, here's what I want to ask you. What is motivating the son to go back to the father? Does he feel guilt? Nah. Does he feel like, oh, my father, I have sinned? No, he's saying, you know what? I'm hungry and they've got plenty. So, I know I'll go back to my dad and say, oh, Dad, I'm so sorry. Just hire me. Yeah? So he doesn't really feel bad. He's just hungry. Right? Right? Okay. Good. So he set off and went to his father. But here the story changes. One of the most grace-filled phrases in all of Scripture begins with verse 20, the middle of that verse. It says, while he was still far off. So, while he was still far away, his father saw him. So, what does that tell you about the father? What's that? He was looking. He was on the porch, waiting for his son. Waiting for his son. Hoping to see his son. Hoping. It says then a few things. It says the next thing is, it says he ran. Now imagine you are a dignified owner. And in the Hebrew culture, you didn't want to show your legs. You didn't want to show your legs. And so you would walk slowly. And there's places in Scripture and Proverbs, it says a man of wisdom walks slowly. Because showing your legs is considered an insult. But it says this old man ran. Now how do you run when you're wearing a robe? Yeah? So the old man and runs to see his son. So the first thing that the father gives up is his dignity. See that? He gives up. He surrenders his dignity. You can't look. I remember once I was camping, and I used to take students, and we'd go hiking for 3 or 4 days in the Appalachian Mountains, and then we'd go whitewater canoeing for 2 days. And a pastor came with us. And a pastor joined us for one of the trips. I was younger. I was 19 or so. And in order to change our clothing, we had to climb into our sleeping bags. And we had to kind of, you know what I mean? And it was very awkward. It was very awkward. Well, one day I'm there cooking a meal, and I look over, and the pastor was changing his clothes, but the zipper came down. And I saw everything. And I was like, whoop. You can't look at someone the same way. Right? The dignity is lost. So when he pulls up, and any of his servants, any of his workers, any of his children, his wife, the community, the town, they would know that he is surrendering something to run to his child. To run. Next, it says, he ran and put his arms around him. Now, where was the son? With the pigs. When he puts his arms around him, what does that make the father? He's unclean. So he takes on the uncleanliness of the son. So the first thing he does, he gives up his dignity. The second thing he does is give up his cleanliness, his own righteousness, his own cleanness, and holds on to his son. Holds on to him. And the third, it says, he kisses him. He kisses him. An old man kissing his son, so that even his lips take on the uncleanliness of the son. Do you see how powerful this is? It's not just, oh, what a good father. His father gives up everything. He's already given half of his estate. Now he's given up his dignity. He's given up his uncleanliness. He's given up his own righteousness to envelop his son, to hold him and to bring him in. It's then the son says something. The son this time says, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. And do you notice he doesn't add the end? Yeah? He doesn't say, hire me. It's only when he witnesses his father surrendering everything, giving everything up, putting it all away, and wrapping his arms around, he goes, Father, I've sinned against heaven and you. I'm not worthy to be your son. So then he sees his fall. That second chapter, he sees that he has nothing left. And he pretty much says, I don't deserve to be your son. He gives up. He gives up. That's it. I'm not worthy. Don't touch me. I'm not worthy. But what does the father do? Quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger. Now the ring on the finger would be a family ring, saying he is now my son again. So the ring means that he is now in the family again. And put sandals on his feet, which meant the son was barefoot. Walking barefoot is considered the lowest of the low. When you have nothing, you are barefoot. And so he'd been walking barefoot the whole time. And take the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. It's a great end of the story, right? It should end right there. Done. Yay! But the older brother, that one, he's out in the field. And what is he doing? He's doing the work. He's cleaning up. And he looks off. Hey, what's going on? What? Why is everybody going crazy? So he calls over one of the servants. Hey, what's going on? And the servant says, good news. Your brother who we thought was lost is found. And we're going to go have a giant feast. And the brother says, what? He's him? That one? We should do that for him? And he gets mad. And he, in all his righteousness, goes to his father. Dad, I've worked all day long for you for as long as I can. I've never done anything wrong by you. And you've never even given me a goat. And you killed a fatted calf for him? That jerk who took half your stuff, who said you wish you were dead? You killed a fatted calf for him? And the father, gracious as he is, says, son, you know I love you. And he says, everything I have is yours, which at this point is true, right? Because he already gave the younger son what he's going to get. He says, everything I have is yours, but we have to celebrate, for your brother was lost and is found, is dead, but is now alive. This idea of lost, but is now found, is dead, but is now alive. It's the way that we see that God takes a mess and makes a miracle. That God takes the struggle, the pain, the hurt, and God transforms it into something else. In the prodigal, the son who deserved nothing, who came home even for the wrong reasons, who came home even for not because he desired grace and good news and his father. He came home just to fill his belly. When witnessing the goodness of the Father, when seeing the graciousness of the Father, when he sees how the Father's love and compassion is honest and true, and how the Father gives everything up for his Son, only then does he know, I'm a mess. I am a mess. And from that, God makes a miracle. God redeems this son. Makes him a son again. Makes him a part of the family. We see this pattern over and over in Scripture. If you think, if you'll, let's go ahead and look at it. Okay. We'll look in First Moses book. Chapter 18. Long story. Abraham was the shepherd of the covenant, the promise that God has. And it's never quite clear why God chose Abraham, but God did. And God says, for many, many times before this, for many chapters, God says, I will be your God, and I will bless you. And he even changes his name from Avram, which means father of many, to Avraham, which is father of the nations. He says, I will bless you. And he says, I will make your descendants like stars. Out of you will come whole nations that will know and call me Lord. But there's a problem with this story, right? Abraham, is supposed to have a baby. But what has happened up to now? And in fact, he's getting old. He's getting too old to have a baby. And his wife, Sarah, well, she's way too old. At one point even, it seems that Abraham doesn't trust God. And so he has Hagar and uses Hagar to have a child named Ishmael. But something's just not right with that. And so it comes to this point in 18. It talks about the Lord appearing to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat by the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. Oh, see, we could sit there in the heat of the day. All right. And he looked up and he saw 3 men standing near him. And it says, when he saw them, what did he do? He ran from the tent. Does that sound familiar? He ran from the tent. So, Avram, recognizing the 3 men, runs. When he saw them, he ran from the tent and he bowed to the ground, which of course means you become subservient, so you give up your power. You honor that person by saying, this is your place. Did you know that the reason why we bow is so that you present your neck to the king or to the person that you are a servant with? And that's why even some, like when they do knights, they put the sword on their neck. And it's to say, your life is mine. Did you know that? That's what bow is about. To make yourself, it's the same way that a dog shows its belly. You know, when the dog's like, ah. It's a way of it's exposing its soft parts, its parts that another animal could. But it says, I submit myself to you. That's why we bow. So it says he bows, presents his neck, says, my life is yours. He said, my Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourself under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and that after that you may pass on. So he says, I'd like to make a little bread. I'd like to wash you up a little bit. So they said, do as you have said. And Abraham hastened, this is 6, Abraham hastened to the tent, and Sarah said, to Sarah and said, make ready quickly 3 measures of flour, and knead it and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it. Does that sound familiar? Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them and stood by them. And they said to him, where is your wife Sarah? Where is your wife Sarah? And he said, in the tent. And they said, I will surely return to you in one season, and your wife, Sarah, will have a son. Okay, so let's imagine you're 95 years old, all right? And your wife is 85 years old. And someone says to you, we'll come back in one season, and Sarah will be pregnant. Do you say, yay? You probably go, ooh. As I told you before, my wife is pregnant, and we weren't expecting this. In fact, we don't know how it happened. It must be the Lord. But suddenly she's pregnant. And she's only 41 years old. And when you're 25 and you're pregnant, people go, oh, congratulations, that's wonderful, good news, great, good news. When you're 41 and pregnant, they go, ooh. Really? Don't you know how that happens? Yeah? You know there's ways to, So now imagine you're 85. What does Sarah do? She goes, right. Sure. Now Abraham and Sarah were advanced. It says in 12, so Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I have grown old, and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, now, why did Sarah laugh? Why did Sarah laugh? And say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? Isn't that a great question to ask yourself every morning? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? And at the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah will have a son. But Sarah's like, oh, I didn't laugh. I didn't laugh. And the man said, yeah, you did. And what does she name her son? Isaac, which means she laughed. Isn't that great? The first thing that we see is that God takes a barren womb. And God has promised to Abraham, you will have descendants. You will have nations. You will become the father of nations. It says, I will bless you so that you will be a blessing to the whole world. But it seemed at 95 that the promise was over, that there would be no covenant, that it would be done. But God takes an empty womb. God takes barren womb, a desert inside Sarah, and brings life. Yeah? See, God takes a mess and makes a miracle. Right? Moses. We won't look at Moses. The people are in slavery. The people are in slavery. How they get into slavery is fascinating. It's through Joseph and the story of Joseph. And I wish I could do the story of Joseph with you. It's fantastic. Because it's like everything that's supposed to be bad becomes good, and everything that's supposed to be good becomes bad. And it just does this the whole time. And eventually all of the people move to Egypt because they're hungry and they need something to eat, and they become very plentiful. And then finally Pharaoh says, too many of you, and he puts them all into slavery. Now the thing I like about this is that you and I both know that there are struggles in this world, yes? And that there are hard things in our life, yeah? I get bothered when people turn those bad things into things that God does. There's a phrase we use in the South, in the United States. And it's, so when someone says, I have cancer, what they'll say to them is, God has a plan. Do you hear that? But what it seems to imply is that God gave that person cancer. Right? That this happened to you for a reason, that God is doing this to you so that you'll learn some lesson. And it makes God the author of bad things. It bothers me. First of all, because God is good and the author of good things. But second of all, we don't need God's help to get into trouble. We're really good at that. All by ourselves, right? I don't need anybody's help to make a mess of my life. I've got it. So the people who got into slavery, they did that. It was just a mess. They got themselves from a place of the covenant and their land and their hope, and then they end up in slavery. It's just a mess. But you see, God does have a plan. But the plan isn't that God makes the mess. Instead, what God does is take and makes a. So instead of saying that God's the one who sent them into slavery, they got there on their own. What God does is enter into slavery, into where they are handcuffed, into where they are chained, and says, I know what to do with this. And he shepherds them. He shepherds them out of Egypt, through the sea. And what I like about that story is they come out the other side of the sea, and where are they? The wilderness. Another mess. Yeah? And God says, I will walk with you through this mess. And I will continue to walk with you through this mess. And through the mess, through the wilderness, you will learn to trust me. So they would say, oh, God, we're so hungry. Well, let's just go back to slavery. Who says that? Who says, I'd rather be a slave with a full belly. But they said it, and God says, here's manna. You know manna? Do you know what manna means in Hebrew? It means, what is it? So it comes out and they go, what is it? That's what it is. And they're like, oh, manna's fine, but we want something to eat that's got meat. So God says, quails. And then they say, oh, we're so thirsty. Why don't we just go back? We're so thirsty. God brings water. Oh, God, snakes biting my ankles. Sets a pole. Over and over and over, they're in a mess, and God makes a miracle. You see that? It's not that God stands between them and bad stuff. I think sometimes we see God, I don't know how to say, a holy goalie. Yeah? Like the goalkeeper in football. Yeah? And he's like there between all the bad stuff coming. And God's job is to be like, ka-choo! You know, like, right? The bad stuff coming. But that is not what God does. What God does is when the messes come, and they do come, God enters into the mess and says, I will transform this into something good. I will make this into something beautiful. Later they land in Israel, and they spend their time in Israel, and they're learning to live into this covenant. When the Babylonians come and cart them all off, carts them all off, and they end up in Babylon, in exile. And in the midst of that exile, in Isaiah says these words. It says, comfort, O comfort my people. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her. For she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, and that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. And a voice cries out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Now remember the wilderness that they were in? And it prepared them in learning how to trust God that God will be with them in their mess, that God will be with them in their struggles. And it says, make straight a desert in the highway for our God, and every valley shall be lifted, and every mountain shall be laid low. So it's like a nice, even, flat road. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain, and then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all people shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord is spoken. So God calls to the people in exile when they're in that mess. And God says, come home, come home, come home, come home. So, God takes a barren womb, makes life. God takes slavery, makes freedom. God takes a wilderness and provides. God takes exile and calls it home. God takes chaos at the very beginning in that creation. God takes what's already there, chaos, and says, light. And we come to the ultimate story. So we've talked about barrenness, we've talked about slavery, we've talked about exile, we've talked about chaos. But what about the ultimate? What about the greatest? What about the biggest problem? What about death? What do we do with death? Is it something we are to fear? Is it the ultimate sign of God's abandonment? That if we were to die, that surely means that God has left us. God sends his son, of course. Sends Jesus. Go back to Roma Breu. Chapter 4. Chapter 4 at 1. This is where Paul brings Abraham into that conversation and says, how was Abraham made right? Was it because he did the right things or was the right person or he followed the law? What made him right? It says in verse 3, Abraham believed God, trusted God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Oh, that's all he did. Just trusted God. And this was before he was circumcised. The point that Paul's making, this is before he's circumcised. So he's not following the law. He's not even in the law, but he's already made righteous. So the law doesn't do this. If we skip forward then to verse 13, it says that God's promise was then realized through faith, through trust. For the promise that he would inherit the world did not come to Abraham or to descendants through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. If it is the adherents of the law who are to be heirs, faith doesn't mean anything. You just follow the law. You don't need to believe, you just live a good life. For the law brings wrath, and the faith is null and the promise is void, for the law brings wrath. For this reason it depends on faith, on trust, in order that the promise may rest on grace. The promise may rest purely on the gift of God. If you skip forward now to chapter 5, verse 12, he goes back to that creation story about Adam, all the way back to Adam. And he makes this comparison. He says, so just as sin came into the world through one man, so too death came in. Death came in through Adam. And sin was indeed in the world before the law, but sin is not reckoned where there is no law. But then it says, 16, and the free gift is not like the effect of the one man's sin. For the judgment following one brought condemnation, but the free gift following many trespasses brings justification. So he says, if we're talking about one sin, you work it out, but all of them together, the free gift of God brings trespasses. And then he goes on to say, in verse 6, in chapter 6, verse 3, do you not know that when you were baptized into Christ, you were baptized into his death? His death. When I work with parents who are baptizing their children, it's always the hardest thing to tell them. I want to say, oh, we get to kill your child. We get to baptize him into the death of Christ. It says, you were baptized into his death. Therefore, we have been buried with him by baptism into death. So there's something about this that God actually invites death and says, Bring it. Bring death on. Because what God does with death is he makes a miracle, yeah? God takes the mess of the cross and brings an empty tomb. And therefore, we have been baptized into that death. Therefore, we are the messes that God is working to make a miracle. That we don't need to fear the chaos. That out of the chaos comes the cross. That no matter what happens, and what happens is we want to look past the chaos, past the cross, and worry about all of this. And we struggle, and I've had many conversations with friends here in Denmark who worry about the struggles and the pain and the hurt and the loss. But none of that makes sense unless you look through the cross. That when we look through here, we say that God is going to do something with all of this. That we can have hope. That we can have joy even. That even though there's a mess in the world, that God can do something wonderful with it. In chapter 5 in this same text, Paul says, not only this, but I boast in my sufferings. How many of you boast in your suffering? How many of you are like, everything stinks? My life is awful. Right? But Paul says, no, we boast in our sufferings. We boast in the struggles. Why? Because suffering produces endurance. Just as the people learned as they went through the wilderness, they learned to endure and to trust and to walk with God. And this endurance produces character. It taught them who they are and how they need God. It taught them their relationship with God through this wilderness. And this character produced hope. It produced good news. So he says, you know, when I suffer, when I am in the worst part of my life, I get happy. Like Moses, I take off my shoes. I'm on holy ground. In the middle of slavery, God comes and takes a mess and makes a miracle. The redemption of Jesus, the story of Jesus, the gift of Jesus is not that Jesus stands between us and death. Jesus invites us so that we might die and rise. Yeah? Yeah? Brothers and sisters, this is great news. This is amazing news. That we don't have to fear anything. That we don't even have to fear death. We don't have to fear the problems that we have. We don't have to fear the struggles. In fact, when we have those struggles, we can kind of invite them in and say, all right, put them up. Because, as it later says, and I'm trying to go fast now because I'm running out of time. Because it says in Romans 8, so if God is for us, who's against us? I love that line. You know what I mean? If God's on my team, what have you got? It's like God puts a wall in that goal. You know? Builds a brick wall into the goal and says, go ahead, try to score. If God is for us, then who could be against us? Tell me. Is there anything too wonderful for God? Could, if you ran away and asked your dad to die, would that be too? Would that separate you from the love of God? Would it? If you were like Moses and you said, Lord, I don't want to do it, would that separate you from the love of God? If you were in slavery, would that separate you from the love of God? This is not a rhetorical question, yes or no? Would that separate you from the love of God? Thank you. And Paul says in verse 8, in chapter 8, he says, not only this, but we are like sheep to be slaughtered, animals killed all the day long. And he says, no, in this we are more than conquerors. They think they're winning. That's the big joke. They think, ha-ha, we've killed you. And we're like, ha-ha, I'm raised. Yeah. They think, and we are more than conquerors through him who died and rose for this. And then he says, for I am convinced. And when he says this, he doesn't mean like, I've been thinking about it and I've made a decision. He says, I stick my flag in this. In Hebrew, they say, I built my ezer, my rock, that sign. This is what I believe, that neither life nor death, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor power, nor height, nor depth, nor anything in all of creation can separate me from the love of God. Do you hear that? Nothing. Get that into your head. Nothing. Nothing can separate you. Nothing. You are loved with the most perfect and holy love. The Father who made you and called you good, whom we turned our back on and said, I wish you were dead, runs to us and puts our arms around us and gives everything to us, his dignity, his very life on the cross, and says, and now nothing will separate us. Nothing. Nothing. What about death, God? Well, watch what I do with death. Watch what I do with death. That is redemption. That is the story of redemption. And it's the chapter of the book that needs to nestle down into the pit of your soul and take root there. For it's where all our joy will come from. I hope the rest of your day you walk around with a little smile on your face. You know? And you know, when somebody says, oh, I don't know if I like the meal, say, well, that won't separate me from the love of God. Right? Oh, my kids are driving me crazy. It's still not separated from the love of God. I was rooting for Brazil last night. Didn't separate me from the love of God. Yeah? I hope that the rest of our day today, that we can fall into the arms of the Father and trust him, because he's the one who takes a mess like us and can and does make a miracle. Amen? Amen. Let's sing Open Our Eyes, Lord, real quick, and we'll be done. Open our eyes, Lord. I want to see Jesus. To reach out and touch him. And say that I love him. And say that I love him. Open my ears. Open our ears, Lord. I want to hear freedom. I want to hear freedom. Open our eyes. Open our eyes, Lord. I want to see Jesus.